Thank you guys for tuning in today, and welcome to another episode of Know Your Stuff, where we provide historical context and examine historical societal concepts and definitions. My name is Zain Raza, and today I'll be talking to Professor of History and the Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, Peter Kuznick. Peter is also the co-author of the book called The Untold History of the United States, which he wrote together with film producer and director Oliver Stone. Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Glad to be with you, Zain.
I want to begin with what is happening right now in the United States, the George Floyd's case. There's this huge uprising taking place and movement, looting, but also grassroots activism and a lot of police brutality. You yourself are not only active in the civil rights movement, but also did a great deal of historical work on it. Could you comment on the recent developments and then proceed to provide some historical context to the situation that minorities such as the African American community had to endure historically?
This is a very exciting moment in American history. I'm old enough to remember the movement in the 1960s, which is a combination of the civil rights movement, the anti-nuclear movement, and the anti-war movement. What we see now is a kind of uprising that we haven't seen since then, even on a bigger scale. After the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, they estimate that there were protests in more than 130 cities in the United States. What we're seeing now is protests that have taken place in well over 400 towns and cities in the United States. We're seeing small towns in the Midwest, in the South, cities in the South. And the thing that's so exciting about this movement is that in many of the instances, although the issue is the denial of basic human rights and social justice to African Americans, what we're seeing is in situation after situation, the majority of the protesters are not Black, they're actually white. And so we have this kind of what we call a rainbow coalition, a very, very diverse coalition and an outpouring of demands against broader social injustice, but especially around the notion that Black lives matter. We have a long history of brutalization of African American bodies in the United States. We can trace this back to the origins of slavery more than 400 years ago. We know that the United States was founded in part on genocide against Native Americans and enslavement of Africans. And that this is a taint upon the soul of America that has never been redressed. And it's been reinforced. So when slavery finally ended, we went back into another stage. It was a period of some progress and liberation. But then we went back into another stage after Reconstruction, where another wave of discrimination against African Americans, which basically lasted until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And we made some progress. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and there was some real progress. And then we saw the rise of a Black middle class, but especially with the recession of 2008. And then since then, we've seen this incidence time after time after time of police murders of African Americans in their custody, overwhelmingly young Black men. And so this has been building up and building up. Began with Trayvon Martin in 2012. Then there was a killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. And then we could go through the list to Rice, one after another, after another, after another. And there have been several recently. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then with this murder of George Floyd in broad daylight in the street of Minneapolis, on camera, with a group of people there protesting and demanding that the police stop this murder, this brutal assassination in broad daylight. And fortunately, they got it on video. And the whole world saw this. there's this thug with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It was too much. So, but you have to put this in the context of the pandemic and the context of the collapse of the economy as a result of that. Now, again, in terms of both of those situations, the African American community suffered disproportionately. I think the ratio of percentage of African American victims of this coronavirus, first of all, was double the white rate of transmission, but also the death rate among African Americans is extraordinarily high. One estimate I saw was 2.4 times as high among African Americans. African Americans were also impacted by the fact that the health care is much worse in their communities, that so many of them are on the front line, that they suffer from poorer housing, preconditions, and so they have been victimized again. And within that context, then they lit the spark with this murder of George Floyd. The other thing about the economics is that not only are African Americans suffering, but everybody's suffering. Up to this point, they estimated 43 million new, over 11 weeks, 43 million more people unemployed. And in the United States, we've got this perverse situation where healthcare is almost entirely tied to people's jobs. So people who get laid off don't even have health insurance anymore. So it's, again, victimization on top of victimization. And much of that black middle class that had been built up from the late 60s until 2008 was wiped out during the recession and the subsequent economic conditions. And we see this crazy disproportion with heavy unemployment, with the economy devastated, and the stock market skyrocketing again. It just makes no sense. So what we're seeing now is a broad sense of the injustice, the brutal, and the fact that so many whites are finally dealing with Black discrimination against African Americans. The polling shows that there is a much greater awareness among white Americans. Previously, surveys showed that whites thought that they were the ones who were being victimized by discrimination in the United States. It blows the mind how they can think that they were victims more than Blacks were victims. But now some of that is changing, actually. And so we're seeing even parts of Trump's reactionary coalition unraveling before our eyes because of the basic indecency. And the other thing that's becoming so apparent is the brutalization of Americans overall by the police structures in the United States. And this has become, it's all over the news. We've seen case after case of the police treating nonviolent protesters in ways that are simply unacceptable. And it's again being captured on film, on camera. So, and then on top of that, you've got a president who does not make any effort to unify the country, simply calls on his old bag of tricks, which is divide and conquer, which is play upon people's fears, American carnage, as he said, and blame things on minorities, try to divide people along racial lines and ethnic lines. And that too is backfiring. The basic indecency of this administration has become so obvious to people that even that has backfired. And when Trump made that absurd ploy recently, where he and Attorney General Barr had the National Guard and the police, all these different police units, attack the protesters and drive them back with tear gas and rubber bullets and pepper sprays and these blasts. Again, they were peacefully protesting, protests that were guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, and the police and the military drove them back so that Trump could walk across the street to have a phony photo op in front of the church there, holding the Bible. This has become so outrageous, American people, that admiral after admiral and general after general have come out publicly denouncing this assault on the Constitution. and saying this is absolutely against anything the United States is supposed to stand for, this political use of the military against the American people. At the same time, they've turned the White House into a fortress. We've never seen anything like this. And during World War II, when they wanted to put pressure on Franklin Roosevelt to beef up security around the White House, he refused to do so. But what is Trump doing? He's got so many levels of security around the White House. Not only did they take over the park outside there, that was always a place of protest, but they've put up fences after fences after fences, moving people back. The White House used to be open to the public. Now you can't drive down those streets. You can't get near the White House. Trump, who's this tough macho guy, is really a coward. He's such a coward. And so he talks tough, and he says, we're going to dominate them. We're going to use the Insurrection Act of 1807, and I'm going to federalize the National Guard and restore law and order. And what does he do at the first sign of protest near the White House? He and his family go down into the bunker. And not only does he go down into the bunker, then he denies it. And he said, I was just inspecting it. When they were down there cowering, people now started to call Trump Bunker Boy. That's his new nickname, Bunker Boy.
You talked about economic issues and also about the police. For example, in my opinion, there's a lot to be said when it comes to economic issues and how it affects the militarization of the police. For example, if neoliberalism and capitalism goes on unchecked, obviously the ruling elites or the people in the corporate structure will require a strong police force, given the amount of people that suffer due to this. Even when it comes to militarization, we can see if resources are squandered abroad, obviously there's lack of resources left to build healthcare systems, infrastructure. And that's why I would like to quote Martin Luther King from a report that he sent to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in May of 1967. And I'm going to start quoting here. We have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. We have to move from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights, an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. We have been in a reform movement, but after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we have moved into a new era, which must be the era of revolution. We must recognize that we can solve our problem now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. So getting back to this topic of economic problems and militarization, I want to constructively criticize the Black Lives Matter movement on that front. Because do you really think that this is a separate issue? It's a race issue, or do you, as Martin Luther King, see this as an issue that is a systemic one? And where do you see the room of improvement with the Black Lives Matter movement?
I wouldn't criticize the Black Lives Matter movement because we've seen such levels of police brutality that is absolutely essential to confront. And most of the people in the movement do have a much broader vision. What we've seen with the economic deprivation of African Americans over the centuries, the average Black family in the United States has less than 1/10 as much wealth as the average white family in the United States. We look at the housing situations, all of the things that are essential for people to have a good life in the United States, and it's not there. The education system, we've got more segregation in the schools in the United States now than we had in the 1950s. And the schools are not equal in any sense, partly because the funding comes through local taxation. And so areas in which there's a disproportionately greater concentration of poverty, the schools do not get the funding that the rich white suburban schools get. So there's so much discrimination going on there. And this is, of course, a broader problem in the United States now. So there's a lot of ways to approach that question. And I think what we need to see is that this immediate movement is about these issues, but the broader movement embraces the idea of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King said, a nation that year after year spends more on the means of violence and repression than on social uplift is a nation that is approaching spiritual death. Martin Luther King understood that. And many people did also. What we've seen in the United States in recent years, you mentioned the neoliberal assault on people's means of livelihood. Budget after budget, what we've seen is cuts in social services, cuts in food stamps, cuts in basic things in healthcare that people need to stay alive, and increases in budgets for the police departments and increases in budgets for the military. In fact, in Trump's February 2020 budget proposal, he proposed cutting funding for the Centers for Disease Control by $1.2 billion and increasing funding for nuclear weapons by $7 billion. So that's what we've seen. And so the point you're making is definitely a valid one, and it's consistent with the protests that we're seeing, because people are recognizing there are so many young people out there. That's such a great sign. On the one hand, that students at the universities are learning about structural racism in their classes. On the other hand, they're saddled with massive amounts of student debt that can make life for them very difficult. The prospects for this generation, even before the pandemic and even before this situation now, prospects for them in terms of social mobility, in terms of reaching even the standard of living of their parents' generation, were very, very poor, and they were aware of this. So what we're seeing is they're coming out to support Black Lives Matter and the protest movement, but they also have their own grievances. So we're seeing a broad radicalization, and that radicalization is very, very encouraging right now. We've just never seen anything like this, really, since the 1960s. Now, the critique that I would make is that there's very little focus on global issues and foreign policy. So even though there have been protest movements in support of what's happening in the United States in city after city around the world, what we haven't seen is the connection of the discrimination and the violence in the United States to the global structures of violence. We haven't seen the raising of the question of America's empire of bases, 800 bases around the world, the sanctions regime around the world, America's unending wars around the world. If they make that connection, which is what I've been trying to do, to show that the money that's being wasted on perfecting the means of killing around the world, rather than on investing in the social needs that people have, is creating a global crisis that can't be solved. And what I think you were getting at is that every important 20th century and 21st century African-American leader has understood that connection. Many of them didn't begin with that understanding, but if you start with W.E.B. Du Bois, and then you look at Paul Robeson, and then you look at Malcolm X, and then you look at Martin Luther King, and then you look at Julian Bond, and you go through the list, every single one of them became more radicalized as their activities expanded. Every single one of them moved towards socialism. Every single one of them moved toward Pan-Africanism. And so they saw that the struggles in the United States were part of a broader global struggle. And it's that same sense that we've got to develop among the activists today. And I'm sure they're open to that. And that's been my effort in terms of this movement, in order to help them grasp that a little more consciously.
It's important to criticize not in terms of we're not trying to put some negative image on anybody, but I think criticism is part of growing, it's part of analyzing and examining where the shortcomings are, and I think it's a healing mechanism.
I tell my students that when I criticize them, it's an act of love. That Believe that?
So let's touch on that. Let's dig deeper into that point about militarization. I think that's a very important connection to make, and very specifically the recent military developments that are happening around the world. Almost every day when I open the news, some sort of international treaty is being thrown out. So there's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that was recently thrown out by the US government, then the Treaty on Open Skies, and now people are expecting the Trump administration to also throw out the START Treaty. Could you go one by one, explain what these treaties are and their significance that they will have on international peace and order?
Yeah, we used to have a global order. We used to have a global architecture of arms control. Unfortunately, that's unraveling. I would begin earlier. I'd begin in 2002 with the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which George W. Bush got rid of so that he could expand America's missile defense programs. That actually led to Russia, as early as 2003, 2004, beginning development of nuclear weapons that could circumvent America's missile defense system. And on March 1st, 2018, in Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation address, he announced that Russia had developed 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent American missile defense. So that was the beginning of this problem. But then it goes beyond that. Then in 2018, the US pulls out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. In 2019, the US pulled, and as we know, the Iran nuclear deal was extraordinarily successful. I mean, if you want a nuclear agreement that seems to work, that was the poster child for it. But Donald Trump, of course, hated it. And the people around him, his advisors, hated it. And they were all very anti-Iran from the beginning. So then in 2019, the US pulls out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. That was put into effect back in 1987 by Reagan and Gorbachev. In the aftermath of the failure at Reykjavik, in which we came within one word, really, of abolishing offensive nuclear weapons entirely, they had the fallback, and it was the INF Treaty. But they eliminated an entire category, an entire class of nuclear weapons. It was a very important treaty. And then Trump in 2019 announces that the US is withdrawing and ends that treaty, accuses the Russians of having violated it, never presents the evidence of that being the case. The Russians deny it, and so that treaty is put on the scrap heap also. And this year, Trump abrogated the Open Skies Treaty, which went into effect it was negotiated, I think, in 1992, went into effect in 2002, and that allowed greater transparency as all the Europeans and Russia and the US could do surveillance flights over each other's territories to ensure them that arms control was working. Another very important treaty, not as important as the INF Treaty, or in my opinion, JCPOA or the ABM Treaty, but a very important treaty. We have US and Russia had other means to surveil each other, but the Europeans didn't. And so this was very important to them. So that one was abrogated. The other dangerous thing is that on May 15th, there was a meeting of national security deputies in the White House, and they talked about beginning nuclear testing again. How insane would that be to begin nuclear testing? What could the US do that would make this a more dangerous world than beginning nuclear testing? The last nuclear tests were in 1992. During the Cold War, there were approximately 2,000 atmospheric nuclear tests, or major nuclear tests, and created an international uproar. Well, they finally stopped doing that. And in 1992, the last U.S. nuclear test. So after 28 years, the U.S. is talking about beginning nuclear testing again. And what would that mean? That everybody would do it. But already, without even doing the nuclear testing, every major nuclear power, all 9 of them, have begun a program of nuclear modernization, making their entire stockpiles more efficient and more deadly. This was begun by Barack Obama, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his speech in Prague calling for nuclear abolition and saying that the U.S. wouldn't be the first country to abolish nuclear weapons, we'd be the last country. And somehow, absurdly, he got the Nobel Peace Prize for that while we were conducting 2 major wars. And then Obama began a nuclear modernization program. He said it was $1 trillion over 30 years. The official estimate is 1.2 trillion. People who know say it's at least 1.7 trillion and probably much more than that. And that's to modernize every aspect of the nuclear stockpile. But other countries are doing that too. And so we're in a very precarious situation because the only treaty of significance left on the books is the New START Treaty, which ends in February 2021. Vladimir Putin implored Trump to renew the New START Treaty for 5 more years.
What is this treaty all about?
This treaty limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons that each side can have to 1,550. It limits the number of launch systems. So it really puts constraints on the size of the nuclear arsenal. If that is gotten rid of, as Trump says he wants to do, Trump says, I don't like that because China's not a party to it. Well, China has maybe 1/20th the size of nuclear arsenal that the U.S. and Russia have. U.S. and Russia have about 93% of the world's nuclear weapons between us. Do we really want China to become part of that and to increase its nuclear arsenal 20-fold? Would that make the world safer? I don't think so. But that's Trump's excuse for not wanting to renew it. What is that going to mean? Back in the 1980s, as recently as the mid-1980s, the world had close to 70,000 nuclear weapons. Now we're down to 14,000, which is far too many, but we had 70,000. We had the equivalent of 1.5 million Hiroshima bombs. And Trump says, I don't fear an arms race, I welcome one. We can outdevelop and outspend everybody else. We're going to win a nuclear arms race. So the problem is you've got a president in the United States who's got his finger on the proverbial nuclear button, who's got veto power over the ongoing existence of life on our planet. And he wants a nuclear arms race. And he says, what's the point of having nuclear weapons if we can't use them? He wants to be able to use them. So in the February 2018 nuclear posture review that Trump administration put forth, it calls for developing 2 new kinds of nuclear weapons, smaller nuclear weapons that would be more usable. All the war games that we do over the years show that there is almost no way to stop a nuclear war when it begins. We've got this fantasy of a limited nuclear war. Now we start this and then the Russians hit back and then we call it off, with minimal casualties and minimal damage. It doesn't work that way. They escalate out of control. And we know that the threshold for nuclear winter is so much lower than people thought in the 1980s that it would not take very much to trigger a nuclear winter that could end life on the planet, effectively end life on the planet. So if we want to kill ourselves off in the short run, before we kill ourselves off with global warming and these crazy pandemics, then we can do it through nuclear war. So it's a very, very, very dangerous situation for our planet.
Let us get to the last part, and I want to leave our viewers with solutions, especially given now that the opportunities have opened up, even though it is a terrible situation at the moment, what is happening with the African American community in America and the coronavirus. I think every crisis presents opportunities. You are part of a global solidarity movement. It's going to be launched, or you can correct me on that if it's already been launched or is going to be launched. And could you talk about this movement, what its main principles are, and what you are aiming to achieve? We have 2 minutes.
Viewers should Google, look up www.globalsolidaritycoalition.org, and you'll read our 9 demands and our manifesto. And what this is people around the world are seeing that we're in the same boat, right? We're facing a global pandemic. What happens in Wuhan, China, affects people in Germany, it affects people in the United States, it affects people in Pakistan, all over the world. We're an interconnected global community. And what we've seen globally is the ravages of 4 decades of neoliberal economic policies, looting policies that have not only destroyed planetary systems that we need in terms of healthcare, in terms of the environment, in terms of the rainforest, the Amazon. What we see is the looting and exploitation of people and resources across the planet to the point where the richest 8 people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 3.8 billion people. So what we did is we put together a global coalition that points to the global structures of inequity and violence that are the enemies of all mankind, that have reached a very small number, that have allowed the power in the hands of some tyrants around the globe. And the people around the world are standing up in the same way that the people in the United States now are standing up for racial justice here. And so we've got this 9-point manifesto. It attacks militarism. It attacks these divisions between rich and poor. It demands health care for people all over the world. But we go through point after point, and we're trying to rally people, saying that these are the kinds of demands that affect everybody, and that we've got to unite on as a global community. People are more and more aware of their global interconnectedness, and that's why we have to rise up together and demand that we take back our planet.
Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and the Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Zay.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the bell below, and to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. My name is Zan Raza. See you guys next time.